Okay, great. Why don't we jump right in? We have about 20 minutes for the presentation, as I understand it, plus another 10 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to tell you in advance, this is the first time I've given the presentation in this format, so this is a bit of a dry run for me as well, but I'm looking forward to your feedback so I can improve it in the future. By way of background, my name is Andrew Ackerman. I run Dreamit Urban Tech. Dreamit is a venture fund and an accelerator focusing on earlier stage, or I should say a little bit more mature startups in the real estate and Proptech space. By a little more mature, I mean companies that have already raised some money and are already post-revenue, but going on to their Series A. We also run a health tech program, and we also run something in secure tech, physical and cybersecurity. But since this is more about setting up a corporate VC, what to do and what not to do, why don't I jump into that? And I can take questions about Dreamit later if you want. If you have questions, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section rather than the chat. It's a little easier for me to follow that way. And I'll try to look at them during the presentation, but odds are I'm going to save them for the end just because it's hard for me to multitask once I'm in full screen mode. Okay? So here we go. I'm going to share my screen and jump right in. Okay, great. So the genesis of this particular piece was I've been having some interesting conversations with a number of people at large, in this case, real estate related companies about setting up a corporate venture fund. And there's a lot of things that people have done wrong about corporate venture in the past that have basically undermined it before it even got started. So this is the culmination of a lot of conversations about the right way to set up a corporate venture fund. So the key takeaway here is that done right, the corporate venture fund can be one of the most effective ways for an organization to kind of in-source innovation from the outside, from startups, but also that the vast majority of the corporate venture funds out there fail this miserably. So let's think about this if it were kind of a fairy tale. I like to think about everything as having a narrative. So once upon a time, a large company decides they want to do this. They want to set up a corporate venture fund. So what do? They go out there and they find a hero. He's somebody with prior venture experience. So they think he's a good person for this particular quest. Then they build the team around him, and they have this big investment committee. They've got a lot of senior managers from the company. They should be, a good part of his posse as he goes out on this mission. And then they equip them, right? They give them the authority to invest a predetermined amount in startups. And they go out on this quest, and then they move slowly. They miss the best deals, and the deals they do get into turn out to be mediocre. And here's why. Oops. Sorry. So what's the reputation that a corporate venture fund has? So they've got really the big hit against them is that the corporate venture funds are staffed by either people who are on their way up or on their way down. So when you dissect, what you mean by someone who has solid venture experience, you got to ask yourself, why would somebody with really good experience in the venture world want to do a corporate venture fund when he or she could just set up their own fund and not deal with all the BS that comes along with dealing with a large corporate? So usually you got two answers. One is it's a guy who didn't succeed in the venture world, and this is a soft landing for him. He could not raise his own fund if he wanted to, and that's exactly the kind of guy you don't want. The kind of person you want is a big up-and-comer, someone who's doing really well. He or she is kind of a rising star and is trying to decide, do they start their own fund or not? There may not be any room for that person to grow at the existing fund that they're at. It's just not big enough to have another partner. So it's really, kind of go out and do your own, or just stay where you are for another couple of years. And they may not be able to raise their own fund just yet. You may be too young. They may not have those connections. So those are the kind of people you want to hire, given the choice for your corporate venture fund. And the way you make that attractive for a rising star is by making your corporate venture fund as much like structurally a regular VC as you possibly can. So you want to have the same I was going to say 2 and 20, but at least a 20% carry structure or as close to it as possible. And you want to give that person the authority to make investments within very broad parameters. And you want to give them the expectation that they're going to go out and raise another fund after. Now, why is all this important? I want to have, if I'm this rising star, I want to have my own book of business. I want to be able to point to it and say, this is me. These are the companies that I selected, and look how well they did. Because that's really what I need if I'm going to raise another second and larger fund. If I don't have that autonomy, then this is really not a useful stepping stone for my next bigger and better opportunity. And frankly, if I could, I'm on the fence between trying to raise a small fund and do it on my own. Why would I give up all the upside that comes along with traditional 20% carried interest? So, it's just not attractive to me unless I have those two other expectations, those two other, that autonomy and that structure. And the fact that I know that the corporate sponsor expects me to go out and, in 2 or 3 years, raise another fund, preferably bigger, and with outside investors, really aligns with where I see my growth going as a VC. And it shows me that this is something that's not just another 2-3 years and then on to something else, but maybe something I could do long-term as part of where I want to grow as a venture capitalist. That's really what you need to do, in terms of structure. And there are a couple of companies out there that are already structured quite that way. One is JLL Spark. They're the corporate venture arm of JLL, a very large brokerage in the US. They set up a $100 million seed and A round fund, and they did structure it very much like a VC. Toyota AI Ventures, same deal, same structure. Again, they built it to attract the right kind of talent. Oops. Okay, let's take the second element of the the fairy tale that went awry. They staffed up an investment committee with senior managers, right? Now that seems pretty logical at first hand, like, hey, let's make sure that we're getting into the right companies. Let's bring, all this deep domain expertise to bear. But really, it's kind of ass backwards, if you'll pardon the language, right? What you're basically putting are the same people who don't know quite how to, access innovation in a blocking role here. They don't really understand startups. They don't really understand what makes a good startup versus a bad startup. And now you're hitching your wheel to them, right? They're the limiting factor, right? So what really do you want from them, right? Really, you want to understand the customer well enough to make sure that you are you're at least talking to startups that are relevant to the senior business, but that's actually not that hard. Any VC who invests in a particular sector needs to get to know his customer or her customer well enough to make that determination, at least at the first pass. They need to know well enough that they know that this is just not a startup that anyone in the industry cares about, or it's something that's a real pain point. So that's actually not a hard limiting factor. And if it ever is, they can call on the line management at any time to bounce ideas off of them. So inserting them into the investment decision deal flow actually adds no value and just slows things down, especially since they're not used to working at startup speeds. Bear in mind that if there's anyone this senior, they've got a lot on their plate. They're dealing with a lot of problems, all of which have many more zeros at the end of them than a $500,000 or $1 million investment in a startup. So you're actually putting yourself at the mercy of people who have very busy schedules, and you may not be their top priority, if not right away, but down the road, when other things are pressing. So as I mentioned, right, the skill set that you need, there is a place for these people, is what I mean to say. It's just not in a investment committee role and not at a time limiting factor. And we're going to go into that a little bit more later. Okay, the last piece of the fairy tale that went awry was that this corporate VC was given the authority to invest a predetermined amount. And I phrased it that way on purpose. Many corporate venture funds will invest off the corporate balance sheet, right? And now, in theory, that should be about the same as having committed capital in a VC fund, right? I mean, $60, $100 million is still $60 or $100 million. What's the big deal about how it's structured and how it's accounted for? The problem is that in practice, things change. If that money is budgeted for and then the corporation as a whole has a bad year the next year, it could be cut. If the champion who set up the corporate venture fund leaves, then you're an orphan, and the people who, you don't have a champion anymore. So the next guy that comes in, he has no upside for your success. If you succeed, you are the last guy's success, and if you fail, it's money he spent. So you are subject to changing budgetary requirements and priorities, and then you're also hit up with some other things like the normal horse trading, right? So if you have to go back to the mothership to spend that money, then you get into like, well, I don't understand why you want to invest in this startup when the startup that I brought to you a week ago, you turned down entirely. And you may have great reasons to turn down that startup, and maybe it sucked, or maybe the market size was too small. But now you're kind of caught up in this kind of horse trading where in order to get the company you want onto your into your fund, you got to go take one that you don't. And then related to that, there's pet projects where politics on the investment committee come into play, where one guy on the investment committee might hold up approval for an investment that's reasonably good. He doesn't care one way or another about, until he has political support for some of his other pet projects that have nothing to do with the corporate venture fund. Again, the fact that it's off balance sheet as opposed to committed capital in a fund relationship exposes you to this kind of corporate BS. And then lastly, you get pushed like, hey, we got this money, let's go bring this startup in. And you might say, I don't want that startup. It's small business. I don't believe in it. And then they'll say, well, but there's this really talented team. In worst case scenario, we'll just, hire them. Well, that takes money out of your corporate fund and out of the performance of your fund for basically an HR function. So anybody who is a rising star in the venture world doesn't want their book dragged down by all this baggage. So really, you need to have dedicated, committed capital in a VC fund relationship, not the, in theory, almost as good off balance sheet commitments. So there's another very subtle risk out here, which a friend of mine actually brought to my attention because it happened to him, right? If you succeed, you can fail. What do I mean by that? Let's say you're set up, it's an off balance sheet, it's, you're an employee, it's not an actual separate fund, and you have one or two really good investments and they exit. And they've promised you a bonus that's the equivalent of that 20% carry. All of a sudden, you might be one of the highest compensated people in the company, right? Leapfrogging over a lot of other people that are much more senior than you. So then there's a lot of pressure to renegotiate that deal. It's like, oh my God, we brought that person in. Why is he or she making that kind of money? So then the corporate renegotiates your comp structure, right? And this person left as a result of that. And I don't blame him. That's not what he signed up for. And remember, all of this is predicated on your ability to catch a rising star rather than a falling dagger. So why set yourself up for failure? Like the smart money, the smart talent, I should say, is not going to get themselves into a situation where something like this can happen. So again, a dedicated corporate venture fund protects that talent and ultimately helps you attract that talent. Okay, so that's really just half the battle, right? I've now kind of gone through what it takes to set up a corporate venture fund as an effective VC fund. But if all you are is just another VC fund, then you're really not playing to any of your strengths. You don't have any kind of unique advantage here over more established venture funds who are out there without the corporate affiliation. So the rest of this talk is going to be about how to leverage the unique strengths of a corporate venture fund over a generic VC. So the key insight here is that no matter how good your venture fund is, the returns are probably going to be rounding error on a Fortune 500 company's balance sheet, or income statement, I should say. So the key insight here is that as far as you're concerned, as far as you, the corporate sponsor, is concerned, it's the insourcing of innovation that's far more important than the returns. Now, this actually works to your favor in a bunch of ways, right? And this is just one strategy. I don't claim it's the only strategy out here that takes advantage of a corporate venture fund's unique strength, but it is one that should work for any corporate venture fund who is arguably a leader in its space. So number one, you got to pick the right stage to invest in. And we're going to go into all this in more detail. Not too early, not too late. You want to make sure you have an allocation strategy that's as cash efficient as possible. And by that, I mean you get the most innovation for the buck you're deploying. Then you want to come up with a strategy for sourcing the startups that you might want to invest in that plays to your strength. And you want to make sure that that strategy takes into account the cadence of that particular startup's fundraising needs, and one that actually is active when it comes to bringing those startups and the innovation into the organization. Let's take that apart one by one. So what do I mean by the right stage? Generally speaking, you want to invest in the Series A. I can answer some of these in the Q&A later if you'd like, but the basic idea is this. Pre-seed, that's usually a $1 million to $2 million round, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, depending what part of the country you're in. Seed round is $1 to $2 million. If you're pre-seed, if you're talking about the friends and family rounds, it's a couple $100,000, or even what's traditionally thought of as an accelerator or an incubator round. You're investing in a lot of science projects and cocktail napkins. Maybe the guys come in with an MVP. You don't really know if that's going to work. You don't really know if it's going to work for your organization. And frankly, the entrepreneurs have never gotten to the let's work with a Fortune 500 company stage yet. So they don't really know how to work with you at all. That's way too early. It's just not ripe. In theory, seed is good, right? You've got, a couple of, the company ideally has a couple of clients that they can refer to, not that many, but, at least something. The product's actually functional. That takes that risk off. But still, by and large, these founders don't know how to work with corporate. And when you're dealing with a corporate sponsor who's specifically trying to learn how to work with startups, it's kind of a recipe for disaster when both parties don't know how to dance. So the best sweet spot for most corporates is Series A. Those founders have at least been working with enough similar companies that they understand how to work with corporate. They've learned a thing or two about how to structure it to work in your environment and to work with a large company. Their expectations on timing are realistic. So at least one party kind of knows what they're doing here. So that's especially important if this is your first go around as a corporate. Now there's an exception, right? So if that company, even a seed stage company, if it's an experienced set of entrepreneurs who've done it before, had a successful exit in something in this industry, then yeah, go for that, because they're probably extremely strong and they're good partners to work with. And if you can get a lot of those, that's great, because you can make smaller seed investments for the same exposure to innovation. But again, those are the exceptions to the rule. By and large, a corporate VC wants to invest in the Series A. Okay, so the second piece here I talked about is to optimize your allocation strategy. So what does that mean? So we're going to get a little technical here. A typical Series A round, at least in New York, is anywhere between $4 and $8 million. So just for sake of argument, let's call it $5 million. Now you could, it's going to be more out in the West Coast. It's going to be a little less in places like Pittsburgh, but this is a good round number to work with. If you are a traditional VC, you can't just follow, right? You've got to lead some rounds. And I'll only unpack that for a moment. Think about it this way. If I just wanted to follow, I'm constantly asking other VCs like, hey, bring me your best deals. I'd like to come along with you. And then those other VCs are like, well, why should I bring you my best deals if they're really that great? I just want to spend all my money on it. Or, which is more often the case, hey, it's a big deal. There's plenty of room for other people. But why would I invite you into my deal when I can invite another VC who sometimes leads and brings me deal? You're just being a taker. I'd rather have, give this particular opportunity to someone else who can reciprocate. So for a traditional VC, and there are exceptions, but for a traditional VC, they need to, mix it up a little bit, lead some deals and follow others. for a, on average $5 million round, you need a minimum check size of about $2 million to lead. You might get away with a little less, but generally not. And then to follow, you're probably going to put in about $500,000, minimum to be meaningful in a $5 million round. So if you want to use rough numbers, you could say your average investment is going to be about $1 million. And overall, you want to reserve about half of your fund for follow-on investments, so that you can invest in the B round and the C round and ride your winners up. So let's run through the math given those assumptions. You're going to make 10 investments a year, roughly. There's a 3-year investment period. So that means 30 investments in your portfolio. That's a pretty typical A-round VC fund. And at $1 million on average, you're going to need $30 million for those initial investments for the first 3 years, and another $30 million reserved for follow-on investments over the next couple of years after that. So you're talking about a $60 million fund for 30 startups, or 30 shots on goal. So let's take a different approach. Let's say we're going to use this different type of corporate venture fund strategy that I've been talking about. Number one, you don't need to reserve money for the follow-on, right? You can do the follow-ons off the balance sheet. It's not ideal. That rising star we keep talking about would probably prefer to have that all, on their own initiative. But in worst case scenario, you can let those rights revert back to that GP, to that rising star, and they can place that money somewhere else. It's not a horrible compromise, and it does mean that you can make, twice as many shots on goal for the same money, or use half the money for the same 30. What's more, and this is more subtle, a corporate venture fund could make a follow-only strategy work. And I'm going to go into that in a lot more detail later, but that means the average check size is going to be, $500K rather than $1 million, or $1 million, sorry, rather than $500,000. So that same $30 million fund can now make 20 investments a year over a 3-year period for the same $30 million, nothing reserved for follow-ons, which means the same $30 million fund has 60 shots on goal, or 60 startups they can potentially partner with. You can slice the numbers different ways. You could do a $15 million fund for the same 30 shots on goal. The math is pretty simple that way. Okay, now what did I say? How can you do a follow-on only round? After all, I just say that was impossible for an for traditional or institutional VC. And what I call, the way it works is what I call the pilot to hard follow. So think about this. Let's say you're a VC fund, or let's say I'm a VC fund, corporate VC fund, and you're the startup. And this is my value proposition to you. So listen, we're interested in your company, but if we want to invest, the first thing we need to do is get you a pilot with the parent organization. If the pilot goes well, we will absolutely commit to follow your next, put $500,000 in your next round at whatever your lead investor sets it at. We're going to follow. You can take that to the bank. You can tell people we are committed. If we can't get you a pilot, or if that pilot does not go well, we won't invest. Right? It's that simple. That's a pretty valuable proposition as far as the startup's concerned. At the very least, they're getting a pilot with a name brand company, which will help them no matter what. And on top of that, the ability to go to a potential lead investor and say, this corporate venture fund is hard committed for $500,000. That's pretty valuable. And that makes you more valuable in some ways than your plain vanilla institutional VC fund. Before I go to this next one, the other thing to remember is, in addition to making you more value, it makes it possible to do the follow only. Because when you come to a startup with that proposition, the startup will make room for you. And the VC fund will not resent you because you've just validated the investment for them, and you're not taking up a meaningful portion of the round. Okay, second to last piece of what I said before was that you have to watch the clock. Depending on what your organization is like, it may take you more or less time to stand up and execute and evaluate a successful pilot. By and large, you have to find an internal champion for it. You have to set the parameters for that particular engagement. You have to come up with what success means, and that's agreed upon by all parties. And then you have to run the pilot for enough time to actually get results. And it could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months. to do this. And it all depends on the organization and the type of startups you're looking at. So I can't give you a firm number on it because your results may vary, but 6 months is a good round number. So what that means, though, is that you as a CVC want to engage the startup very soon after they've raised their seed round. And why is that? Generally speaking, any round will last a company for about 18 months. That's usually what they're advised to raise. And as a practical matter, they need to get to their next milestones by month 12 because it could take them 3 to 6 months to raise their next round. You, in order to be not too late to the party, need to finish your pilot with that startup before month 12 after they've raised their seed round. Or else you're too late. You might get left out of the round just because the timing's not good enough and you don't have your data in hand yet. That means that you as a corporate venture fund need to find the startups that you want to pilot and decide that you want to pilot them within the first 6 months after they've raised their seed round. So the timing is actually pretty tight. The good news is with AngelList and Crunchbase, you can pretty much get instantaneous notification whenever a company does raise their seed round. So it's doable. But that's the time frame you're looking for. And lastly, you got to sweat the details, right? You've got to get this in writing. Most startups are smart enough that they know that they don't want to burn a bridge, right? If they've committed to you that they'll take your money and they've told the VCs that no corporate venture fund XYZ is in for 500,000, they won't stiff you. Some are not that good at it though, and sometimes a greedy VC, a VC that says, "Oh, I want the entire round," will try to elbow you out. So you want everything that we've just discussed. You want to actually be a contractual relationship between you and the startup that you're considering investing in. At Dreamit, we use something called an investor rights agreement. And the truth is, at the end of the day, you're not going to kill a deal. You're not going to kill it. I mean, that doesn't do anyone any good, but it guarantees you a seat at the table and it guarantees you leverage if the lead investor is starting to behave badly. And maybe depending on how you do it, you'll maintain your investment right and other people will get crammed down. Okay, now I wrote, what do I mean by not relying on autopilot? And what I mean by that is you can't assume that once you've made this investment, they'll automatically get a pilot, right? The business units are busy. They've got to do what they do, right? They've got their regular operating their business. They've got their numbers to hit. They get their bonuses based on stuff that have nothing to do with the corporate venture fund, right? So simply putting those startups out there doesn't guarantee you any of those pilots are going to get done. And if they don't get done, you don't get the data that you need to decide if you want to invest, and your entire value proposition falls apart as far as the startups are concerned. So you have to actively sell the startups you want to invest in to the business units to make sure those pilots get done. And there's two main ways to do this. And this is probably a presentation all on its own. So I'm just going to breeze through it to give you a sense of it. And maybe some other time we can go into this in more detail. But one is informal. Somebody within the corporate venture fund has to be the consummate politician or salesman. He or she knows who in the business unit is serious about engaging in pilots and who just pays it lip service, who has the capacity to take on more pilots and who's full up, just too busy, right? And then basically makes sure these things happen, makes those matches, gets them excited about it, sells it to the business unit line. Now, there's some pros and cons to this approach. Number one, it's fast. It's easy to implement. You don't have to step on people's toes by changing compensation or making different kind of structural events to happen. So the organizational change required is minimal. The downside is it takes a lot of finesse. So not everyone has those skills. And in many cases, you may simply not be able to invest in a really good startup just because you don't have an appropriate corporate sponsor on the pilot side. But it's just not within the art of the possible, which is how they define politics. So the harder way to do this in many ways is a formal structure. Now, what that means is that you're putting together regular events and comp changes to make this happen. You might have multi-city pitch events or startup challenges. You might even build it into the regular job descriptions of everybody at a certain level of management and hire that they have to put a couple hours each month into reviewing the startups that the company is considering investing in. And there's a lot more you can do there, but it means really changing people's job descriptions and ultimately their comp structure, right? If they have a very awkward conversation with HR every 6 months to a year, which is okay. How many startups have you partnered with or piloted with over the past 6 months to a year? And they keep saying no, and they just can't get promoted until they've done it. That makes it top of mind. So there's a lot of things you can do there to really, really make structural changes to the organization to bring innovation in. And in the end of the day, that is the right way to do it if you can swing it, right? It will make deeper and more lasting changes to the corporate parent. The problem is it's tough, right? It's a lot of work. Compensation is a very sensitive topic, and it's really tricky to get it right. And you'll get pushback. So as a practical matter, I would imagine that most of the CVCs will start informally, rack up a few wins, and then move to a more formal structure. But there's a lot more here than I just put on this slide. I just wanted to give you a flavor of the challenges and the opportunities and the approaches, because ultimately you do have to come up with an answer to this or everything else fails. But you cannot rely on autopilot. And as bonus material in the, minus 2 minutes I have left, sorry, I'm over. The bonus material here is, what skill set do you need for the person we're going to hire? I've told you want to catch a rising star. That's great, but it's not really very granular. So how does the skill set, is it similar or differ from a traditional VC? So number one critical skill is marketing, right? You need to be able to market these things externally to startups, right? If any of you come from a marketing background, there's a pull versus push strategy. Traditional VCs, especially when they're getting started and can't rely on their name, have to go out there and pound the pavement and look for startups and bring them in. In this case, you can basically, with the reputation of the parent organization, create enough buzz about what you're doing that the startups come to you. I like to say you're climbing a hill, planting a flag, getting a megaphone, and then yelling, "Hey, I'm here. Here's my deal." Number two, you need that political savvy, especially if you're relying on the informal relationships to get to pilot. And you need some of the process savvy. And that's especially important if you're going to go with the formal approach. But regardless of which approach you take, you need a little bit of both. Now, ironically, the things that are less important are the domain expertise, right? You have the entire corporate structure to lean on. So the fact that you have not been in real estate or in construction for the past 20 years is less important. You have that set of skills to lean on. And the same goes for the industry relationships. Knowing 100 people in the space that you can call in the spur of the moment to get a pilot is less important, given that you have the institutional strengths of your corporate sponsor. Traditional sourcing skills. Like I said before, this is more of a pull strategy. You don't have to beat the pavement the same way. You have a pilot with a Fortune 500 company as bait. You should be able to catch fish that way. Now, on the valuation side, a lot of what a VC needs to do is to figure out what the right valuation is and how to structure that deal. That's actually less important in this case because you're only following. So your lead investor will set that valuation and you'll insist on getting the exact same deal terms. You may want to put some bounds on it so it's not totally a punt, but you can lean on them for a lot of that. And last but not least, the actual due diligence process. If they have a financial lead investor, traditional VC, they'll be doing their due diligence. You can lean on that a bit. I wouldn't recommend leaning on it entirely, so you should be doing some of your own due diligence, but it's a second level of due diligence. Plus, remember, you've lived with this company now for over 6 months. You have a successful pilot. You know how the product works. So in some ways, you've already done a good chunk of that due diligence. So all of those skills that I just rattled off are in the nice to have rather than critical category for a corporate venture fund. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the presentation, I believe. Let me just double check. There's a lot of people I'd like to acknowledge. You can see them on your screen. They've helped me kind of work on these ideas over the time, but I'm open for questions. So I don't see any questions in the chat room or in the Q&A. I'm not sure if that's just because I'm still in sharing mode, but Oh, okay. So I have a question from Yerbal. Do I have a corporate venture fund? We don't. Dreamit is structured a little differently. Dreamit, as I alluded to before, is a venture fund as well as an accelerator program. So we're vertically focused, and part of our value proposition is that we do have 58 or 59 corporate partners in the real estate and construction space. So in an odd sort of way, we fulfill the exact same functions I talked about before. We have those informal connections to the people who are ready to pilot. That's a large part of our bait in the water when we bring companies in. We do not invest up front. We do everything that we do for the right to invest in their startup when they do raise their next round. The investment rights we have are $500,000, so I did not choose that number arbitrarily, and we do use an investor rights agreement to secure those rights down the road. So a lot of what I've talked about there I know works because we've done a version of that with Dreamit. Next question from Simon. A little more detail about the investor rights agreement. I can give you a little more. I can't give you a lot more without taking another 20 minutes or so. So let me just go very, very high level. The investor rights agreement should be a contractual obligation between the corporate venture fund and the startup, giving them the right but not the obligation to invest up to $500,000 or exactly $500,000 in the next round. And it should specify that it's along the exact same terms as the lead investor, the exact same valuation. You could try to build a discount into it. Dreamit does get a discount, but we're a little different that way. I would try not to be greedy there. You want it to be as simple as possible. You don't want to give the startup too much to think about. Like, why would I want to do that? So it wants to be clean and clear and simple as possible, but you want it to be ironclad. You could probably accomplish the same thing with warrants, though there may be tax implications, but that is a much longer conversation. Next question. Do I recommend that startups pursue corporate venture? Great question. Reputation that corps have is that they move slow, and they sometimes will put unacceptable strings on a deal. So they have a bad reputation, but I wouldn't dismiss them entirely, especially in certain industries where the corporates can really open a lot of doors for you. In a lot of ways, I would say, and this is my opinion, but I think a lot of people would echo it, the ideal structure for a startup, a cap table structure, is to have an institutional investor, a traditional VC, who leads the round, and then to have one or more strategics that invest along the same way. And if you're at the seed stage, the strategics could be individual angels, and as you get later on, they could be corporate venture funds. As long as you have an institutional who's on your board, he can or she can protect you somewhat against things down the road where the corporate venture fund or the strategic might actually behave badly because they have different incentives than you do. So I would avoid an all strategic board. I would avoid an all strategic round if you can, but I would definitely consider adding them because they can open a lot of doors to a lot of pilots and a lot of expertise and partnerships. Cool. So next question. Should I be, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, should I be concerned about exposing too much to a potential customer and the risk of competitive issues if a corporation invests? Great question. So usually you deal with this with investment rights, information rights. So so let's take this apart step by step. The corporate venture fund should have standard information rights. You should, if you're concerned about it, have the ability to withhold information that's for specific customers that may be competitive, and that needs to be very clear. The bigger issue around that is if you have a corporation X as your corporate venture partner, would that ever make customer Y, who's a competitor of corporation X, unwilling to use your service? It's a danger. It varies from industry to industry, the appetite of companies to cooperate or not. Generally speaking, I think it's doable. It's manageable, especially if you stress to new customers that, hey, they're an investor, it's arm's length. You have certain you don't provide them with all the information. But it'll vary from industry to industry, and it is a legitimate concern. On the other hand, if you are a seed stage company and you're looking for your big break to get to an A, you could have zero encumbrances for new customers, but also zero large customers. And then you die and you'll get to the A round because you just don't have that traction. So it's probably the kind of deal that you should consider very closely, but it's a good question. Another question, and I want to be respectful of time, so this may be the last or the second to last question. What kind of Proptech startups are hot currently, and do we follow or lead? That is a very long conversation. I'll answer the first one first. We always follow. We're kind of a flipped VC fund. And I say flipped VC because most VC funds, they'll do their due diligence very heavily. They'll then put their money in, and then they open up their Rolodex and roll up their sleeves and do a lot of work with them. We do it just the opposite. We do a moderate amount of due diligence up front. We don't pull all your data, dig into your financials. We make sure that at a top level, you're solving the right kind of problems, big problems, exciting problems. And it's aligned with what the large potential customers in the space are looking for. And then we roll up our sleeves and start working before we put a penny in. We make introductions to investors, we make introductions to customers. We actually have a formal 2-week period called customer sprints in the middle of the program. We bring Proptech and construction tech startups into the corporate offices to meet with C-level people. And then at the end of the program, we have another 2-week period where we bring the startups into the VC's offices, the venture capitalists who can lead their institutional rounds for 20-minute one-on-one sit-downs. It's a very different way to do it, but we do all that heavy lifting first. And then we see how the customers and the investors respond. We see how the startups close those deals, those introductions that we've made. And that's part of our due diligence. And then we invest in the end. So we're always following in that case. And I'm going to punt on the second part of your questions. You want to know the ones that we think are super hot? Go check out the portfolio on the dreamit.com page. On the portfolio page under Urban Tech, it'll tell you exactly the stuff that we love. There's others that we haven't invested in yet, but that's not a 2-minute conversation. Cool. Another question was, is this being recorded? The answer is yes. I don't know the process for getting it, so you'll have to ask the host. My guess is he'll probably send out the link to the recording to everyone who is registered for this particular presentation. At least I hope I get a copy of the recording. Okay, last question perhaps. What stage does Dreamit like to talk to a startup, and would the result be to set up an investment rights agreement email to, okay, great. So the right stage for the Dreamit program is post-seed, pre-series A, generally speaking. More specifically, are you post-revenue? Do you have referenceable customers? Because the kind of customers that we put our startups in front of have to be corporate ready. Like if I have a company that's in the construction tech space and I'm bringing it to Skanska, one of the top 10 largest global construction firms, general contracting firms, they need to be ready to work with Skanska. And one of the ways I know you're ready to work with Skanska is you're already working with Suffolk, right? Or Whiting Turner or DPR, right? So having referenceable customers like that is critical to you having that kind of street cred. Another exception, sometimes I'll see a startup that's earlier, but I know from my interactions with the customer that they have been waiting for this startup for years. And if I know that they're waiting for years, I'll bring them in even if they're a little less than entirely ripe, because I know that the kind of burning need for that solution will make them more willing to partner even before they have that proof point. But it's a bet on my part, and it's the exception rather than the rule. Now, that said, I like to talk to startups even a little earlier than that. I play a long game, so even if it's a pre-seed startup, preferably not idea stage, but as long as it's a pre-seed startup, they're going out there and they're trying to get their first couple of customers and they've got something, I'm happy to talk early on and even help. Some of our corporate partners do have appetite to get involved a little earlier, selectively, So if I find something that I really like, and I know that one of our corporate partners is willing to get involved early on, and this is a pain point for them, I will make informal introductions in advance, purely as a courtesy. No strings, no investor rights agreement for that. That's just me trying to help out both a promising startup and a corporate relationship of ours. And hopefully it gets to the stage within the next 6 months or 9 months where they are in Dreamit Strike Zone. We can take them into the program formally. But that's all informal. The only time we ask for the investor rights agreement is when we have a company in our program. And that's when we do the formal 2 weeks of customer sprints, and then ultimately the formal 2 weeks of investor sprints. Okay, we're now way over officially, so why don't I thank everyone for coming. If you have additional questions, you want to reach out to me directly, my email is andrew@dreamit.com. It's pretty simple, andrew@dreamit.com. I will put that in the chat, I guess. I'll just type it in there while we're talking. So please feel free to reach out to me directly. My only pet peeve is that you use a very informative subject line. So something like, global Proptech session or CVC presentation, and then more of what you want. That will help me understand what we're referring to. And from our host, that they will share the video sometime in January, in Netflix-like channel. So we'll see. Looking forward to doing that. And by the way, even if you don't have any questions, I would love your feedback. This is the first time I've given the presentation in this format. Sorry, Netherflix. I have no idea what Netherflix means. This is the first time I've given the presentation in this in this format. So if anything worked or anything didn't work, or if you think I'm totally full of crap, please let me know. Anyway, thanks again.
Well, Andrew, I want to thank you for this great presentation. It was a very good listen, and everyone for participating in this session. I hope to see you soon in a further event of Global Proptech Online.
Super. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a nice evening all. Have a nice day.